Hello! Welcome back to the library. Our story starts a bit further back than the PlayStation today, specifically around the time of November 1993. A 16-year-old Jason is still a year shy of being able to buy his own video games, mature rated, and 2 years shy of being able to sell back games. Unfettered by the sands of time, he drags his mom with him and his 3 Super Nintendo games to the electronics boutique inside his favorite mall. They were having a special trade-in 3 games and get 1 free across all the new releases, including Lethal Enforcers for the Sega CD with the blue justifier. For the record, one of the games I traded in was a mint box complete copy of Super Metroid. You can send your hate mail to if I only knew then at whatiknownow.com. Anyway, let me tell you there was nothing like the feeling of carrying that oversized box through the mall, anticipating that first pull of the light blue justifier's trigger, tagging down criminals like it was the only thing worth living for. My love for the game started in the arcade in the same mall a few months earlier. Now, in 1993, home libraries and arcades spoiled us rotten with Mortal Kombat 2, Super Street Fighter 2, Gunstar Heroes, NBA Jam, Star Fox, Doom, and the list goes on. But none of them had what Lethal Enforcers had, and that one silly feature was the silliest of them all. It had my city in it. My kind of town, my sweet home, the windy city of Chicago. Digitized photos of real-world locations, vehicles, and streets you could see at any given time were now crunching quarters and taking high scores. At the time, Konami was still located in Wooddale, Illinois, a measly hour away from downtown Chicago. The developers took their cameras to the city and photographed everything they could to bring Lethal Enforcers to life, including the beloved Chinatown. The in-game restaurant and building in Chinatown Assault were there, as were the famous L trains and ticket counters. Digitized graphics were still new in the mainstream, and while games like Night Trap and Mortal Kombat brought that realistic visual style home in movie-like experiences, seeing your town just hit differently, and boy did the home versions ever hit differently. I loved the Sega CD version despite its obvious hardware limitations, missing animations, name changes, missing visual elements, and rewritten car sequences that I sent away for the pink second player justifier. I don't remember if I ever actually played with anyone else, but I am sure I rocked both of these babies simultaneously. Forget ranking sergeant, I was pulling double captains, and I loved it. So you can imagine the shock of 20-year-old Jason when he was working at the family game store when inside a shipping carton was a fresh stack of Lethal Enforcers 1 and 2 for the PlayStation. It was both games on one disc for my favorite game system, and it was still Light-Gun compatible. I bought it that day and maniacally laughed all the way home. That's when my dreams of finally having an arcade-perfect copy of Lethal Enforcers were dashed once again. Only this time, it was more curiosity about steps taken rather than the overall final product. Thanks to some, how shall we say, peculiar team management, Konami left the translation to 2 18-year-olds. Working together with one on the Saturn side and one on the PlayStation side, their journey into rebuilding the games is an eye-opener. Thanks to a conversation with the said developer, the reasons for the changes involve them essentially having to rebuild the game from scratch on their own. The tile maps were stored on an Amiga 500, recovered and hand-assembled back into their usable animation frames. From there, they used Photoshop to tweak and adjust as needed. They didn't even have the original gameplay script. They just had to eyeball it while watching the actual arcade machine, like a human reel-to-reel transfer. Their work paid off, though. Colors are more vibrant and saturated, with less washed-out looks like in the arcade. Visuals are crisper, with sharper details, with now clearly legible words on cars and buildings that were removed prior. Sound effects and music were more refined and impactful. The original soundtrack came screaming out of the PlayStation like you were there at the arcade. It was utterly gorgeous. This isn't a true one-to-one conversion though, as visual elements did change in various ways due to the nature of home development. For starters, the first customer counter is huge compared to the arcade in the opening bank robbery level. Some of the paperwork in its center column is different. Once out in the alleyway, the corner of the wall is missing its green pipe decoration. The chase scene's cars are hilariously pixelated and slightly different, probably due to hardware limitations. Oddly, the tires were also swapped out and upgraded, perhaps to fix a visual hiccup in the original arcade version. The delivery truck with that level's end boss has an all-new, admittedly awesome look to it. And it goes on like that from there. More peculiar is that they must have had multiple angles photographed for each object during the original arcade's pre-production. Several assets are now slightly repositioned, usually for the better. In the airport stage, various logos and company names that were blurred out are now in full view and fully legible. Oddly enough, the cargo containers have different logos, while one stage now occurs at a completely different time of day. Whether this was intentional or not by the two devs was more likely than just them being able to use whatever they could successfully retrieve from the Amiga 500. The visuals and audio comparisons aside, the question that needs to be asked is, have the games held up after all these years? From a light gun perspective, hell yeah! As an overall experience, it depends heavily on your nostalgia. Having finally played Lethal Enforcers 2 for the first time through this compilation, the two games approach their livelihood from opposite directions. The original is a slower, methodical tour through various locations, culminating in taking down a kingpin who just happens to own a military attack chopper. Enemy spawns are more controlled and spaced out between instances. There is a chance to breathe every so often between villains. Somewhat unique to the original is how it handles power-ups. Power-ups are just different guns to use. They can have faster firing rates, larger capacities, larger areas of effect, and more. The problem is that trying to keep the gun is a pain in the ass, as it's lost on the first time you're hit. Trying to keep it long enough to reach the stage boss is a game in and of itself. And I kept losing it. As I said earlier, this was my first time playing Part 2, and sweet baby Jesus, is it ever the polar opposite? In Lethal Enforcers 2, players are whisked away to the Old West with cowboys, Indians, and bank robbers as far as the eye can see. The pace is much more frantic, with multiple characters on screen in rapid succession. Levels are broken down into smaller sections, letting players breathe between them rather than the enemies like the original. Most curious is how the sequel handles the visual differences between good and bad guys. Part 1 used suits, masks, and sunglasses to make the villains stand out from the innocent civilians. In Part 2, there's nothing. You just need to wait for someone to draw a gun. Discerning between innocent and guilty takes an extra moment of clarity not found in the first run. It adds a tenseness that was missing prior. Weapon power-ups in the second game come across more like saviors, a momentary edge against endless waves before it's stripped away by a bank robber's bullet. A particularly funny moment is had when that pickup just happens to be a cannon with cannonballs. There is always an element of suspending disbelief in video games, but my god, the thought of some poor lawman trying to rapid-fire a cannon always makes me chuckle. Having played both games a minimum of 3 times between reviewing and recording footage, I can safely say my love for them is still there, probably now more so since finally playing Part 2. There's just something comforting in old Lycan games. I have nothing against modern graphics and animation, but simple 4-frame villains with a plastic gun in my hand just hits differently. It's a nostalgia-filled wonderland striking a balance between the Sega CD, the arcade, and now the PlayStation memories. An evolution modern gamers will never experience. Which may explain a few things. Closing out the review, it's a weird give and take with the overall experience. I adore how much better the overall game looks, and still having a CRT means I, and the bright green justifier, can relive the glory days of yesteryear. Knowing the conversion was the work of essentially 2 people makes the quality stand out that much more. It's still not a true one-to-one conversion, but then at this point, I don't really need that. Just being able to still play it is worth it. Lethal Enforcers 1 and 2 is a no-frills release, lacking programmer's cheats, Game Plus modes, hell, even credits. But what it does present is a cleaner, more high-resolution, and mostly upgraded take on the 2 arcade favorites. That its development was almost done single-handedly is a pretty good excuse for those elements missing. Its sheer existence is a wonder in all its own. On the Game-Rave review scale, it's a solid 7 out of 10. If you have a PlayStation light gun and access to a CRT, it deserves a once through or 2. Alright guys, that does for this review. Another Poly Mega Journal is in the wings. Be safe. I will see you then. Take care.
Captain.